The blackout struck the Blackwell Enterprises Tower at 9:17 p.m. on a Thursday in late October, a sudden, merciless plunge into darkness that swallowed the 18th floor elevator like a throat closing around a scream. Trapping Billionaire CEO Alexander Alex Grant and his temporary personal assistant Olivia Harper, hired exactly 2 weeks ago to cover for his vacationing executive assistant Margaret, who was on a long-planned cruise in the Mediterranean with her husband, celebrating their 30th anniversary, between the 18th and 19th floors for what would become the longest, most transformative 6 hours of their lives. The air already thick with the day's residual heat from the malfunctioning HVAC system that had been flickering warnings all afternoon on the digital panels in the lobby. The metallic bite of panic rising as the emergency light sputtered once, twice, then died completely, leaving only the pulsing red glow of the alarm button and the ragged, animal sound of their breathing echoing off the polished steel walls that suddenly felt closer than physics allowed. The mirrored panels reflecting distorted shadows of two strangers who had shared nothing but polite nods and coffee orders until this moment. Alex, 38, usually armored in bespoke silence and the kind of controlled detachment that made boardrooms flinch and competitors recalculate their entire strategies overnight, felt the walls shrink inward like a coffin lid slamming shut, his pulse hammering against the starch collar of his midnight blue Tom Ford shirt, the one Elena had picked out for him 3 Christmases ago during a rare weekend in Aspen when they still pretended to be in love, and he'd worn it like a penance ever since, because throwing it out felt like admitting defeat. While Olivia, 26, with her chestnut curls pulled into a practical ponytail that had started the day neat but now hung in damp tendrils against her neck, her thrift store blazer that still smelled faintly of diner grease from her weekend shifts at the corner cafe on 5th and Halsted, where she waited tables to pay down her mother's medical debt, pressed her spine to the corner and whispered, "I can't do small spaces," her voice fracturing like glass under pressure, the words slipping out before she could cage them behind the professional mask she'd perfected over years of being invisible, of learning to take up as little room as possible in every room she entered. And in that single confession, the dam broke wide open. Alex, for the first time in years, spoke without calculation, without the filter of press releases or investor calls, or the carefully curated image his PR team had built brick by brick, admitting how his wife Elena's untreated depression had hollowed their marriage into a museum of polite silences and separate bedrooms and scheduled date nights that felt like board meetings, until one dawn in April she vanished with only a note on the kitchen island that read, "I need air you can't give me, Alex. Don't follow, don't look for me, just let me breathe," leaving him drowning in billion-dollar deals that suddenly felt like paper chains around his ankles, the kind that cut deeper the more you struggled, the kind that made him wake up at 3 a.m. wondering if the empire he'd built was just a prettier cage. Olivia, trembling in the dark, her knees drawn to her chest to make herself smaller, to disappear into the corner like she had in closets and under beds and behind furniture her whole childhood, shared how her father's drunken rages had taught her to flinch at raised voices and polished shoes and the sound of ice clinking in a glass, how she'd learned to disappear before she was seen, how at 16 she'd hidden in a closet with a broken rib and counted heartbeats until the storm passed, how the sound of a belt unbuckling still woke her some nights, even though he'd been dead for 5 years from cirrhosis in a hospital bed she couldn't afford to visit, and a sweat glued their clothes to skin, and the temperature climbed past 90 degrees, the elevator transforming into a pressure cooker of heat and truth and shared breath, their stories braided together in the blackness. His guilt for not noticing Elena's silence until it became absence, for missing the way she'd stopped laughing at his dry jokes or touching the small of his back when they passed in the hallway, or leaving her sketchbooks open on the kitchen table like invitations he never accepted. Her shame for still loving the father who'd once shattered her wrist with a beer bottle because he'd also taught her to ride a bike on the cracked sidewalk in front of their South Side duplex and read her Where the Wild Things Are when she had chickenpox and braided her hair with clumsy fingers the night before her first day of kindergarten. until Alex reached blindly across the 2 feet of space that separated them and found Olivia's hand, not for romance, but for anchor, for proof that he wasn't alone in the void. And she didn't pull away, her fingers curling instinctively around his like a lifeline thrown into a riptide, her palm calloused from years of carrying trays and scrubbing counters and holding her mother's hand through chemo treatments. His manicured, but scarred across the knuckles from the night he'd punched a hole in the drywall after reading Elena's note and then showed up to a 7 a.m. investor call with plaster dust in his hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Minutes bled into hours, the elevator a confessional without absolution, a womb and a tomb all at once, and they talked, really talked, about the childhood dog Alex had buried in the backyard at 12 and never cried for, because his father said men don't cry over pets, they bury them and move on. About the scholarship Olivia lost when her father spent the tuition money on blackjack in Atlantic City, and she'd had to drop out of community college after 1 semester to work double shifts at the diner to keep the lights on. About the way fear tastes like copper on the tongue, and how loneliness can feel heavier than any physical weight, heavier than the steel box suspending them 30 stories above the city where people lived entire lives without ever looking up. Olivia laughed, a startled, rusty sound that echoed strangely in the dark, when Alex admitted he still checked under the bed for monsters at 38 because the real ones wore custom suits and sat across from him in boardrooms smiling while they planned to gut his company. And he felt something crack open in his chest when she whispered that she'd once drawn a map of every safe place in her childhood home, under the porch where the spiders lived but never bit, behind the dryer where the lint muffled screams and the heat felt like a blanket, inside the hollow oak in the backyard where she'd carved her initials with a pocket knife her father gave her for her 10th birthday, and still carried it folded in her wallet like a talisman against the world, like a promise that there would always be somewhere to hide.
The air grew so thick they could taste each other's breath, the faint mint of Alex's gum from the pack he kept in his breast pocket, mixing with the coffee on Olivia's tongue from the cup she'd grabbed on her way to the elevator, and when Olivia's voice cracked on the memory of her mother's funeral, she died owing the hospital $43,000 and I was 19, working double shifts at the diner to pay the bills while Dad drank the rent money, and I had to sell her wedding ring to cover the casket. Alex pulled her gently against his side, not caring that his shirt was soaked with her tears and his sweat, murmuring, "You're not alone in this anymore," and meaning it with a ferocity that startled them both, his arm wrapping around her shoulders like he could shield her from every ghost that had ever chased her, from every bill collector and every memory and every night she'd fallen asleep hungry. They played games to survive the claustrophobia, 20 questions about favorite smells. His, fresh coffee at 5 a.m. before the city wakes up, and rain on concrete after a heat wave. Hers, old library books that smell like vanilla and dust, her grandmother's lavender soap from the little shop in Hyde Park, and the inside of a new sketchbook before the first mark is made. Truth or truth, because dares were impossible in a 6x6 box suspended by cables that creaked ominously every few minutes like they might snap. And when Olivia admitted she'd been planning to resign at dawn because men like you see right through people like me, and I'm tired of being invisible, tired of being the girl who brings coffee and disappears when the meeting starts, tired of smiling when I want to scream, Alex countered softly, "I've been blind for years, Liv. Tonight, you're the only thing I can see, the only thing that feels real." His thumb tracing the lifeline on her palm like reading Braille for hope, feeling the tiny scar where she'd cut herself on a broken plate at 15, trying to clean up after one of her father's rages. The heat became unbearable, their shirts clinging like second skins, the wool of Alex's jacket abandoned in a heap in the corner, Olivia's blazer discarded beside it like shed armor, and at hour 4 Olivia's breathing turned shallow, panic clawing at the edges with hot fingers, her chest tightening until she gasped, I can't breathe, it's too small, it's closing in." So Alex taught her box breathing, 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out, 4 hold. Voice steady as a metronome, counting aloud until her pulse slowed against his wrist where he'd press 2 fingers to check, the rhythm syncing with his own until they were breathing as one organism in the dark, 2 hearts learning the same cadence. They spoke of dreams abandoned, his architecture degree traded for an MBA to save the family firm after his father's heart attack when he was 22, the sketches of skyscrapers with living walls and rooftop gardens he still hid in a locked drawer at home.
her art portfolio buried under diner shifts and medical debt and the weight of survival. The watercolor of Lake Michigan at sunrise she'd painted the week her mother died and never shown anyone because it felt too raw, too much like hope. Promises neither had dared voice aloud, like Alex's secret wish to disappear to a cabin in Montana with nothing but a fishing rod, silence, and the kind of peace that didn't come with a price tag or a press release. Or Olivia's fantasy of opening a tiny bookstore in a converted train car where broken people could hide among stories and no one would ask why they flinched at loud voices or why they always sat with their back to the wall. When the elevator lurched suddenly at hour 5, dropping 6 inches before catching with a metallic screech that reverberated through their bones and made the cable sing, Olivia screamed and Alex caught her, arms wrapping around her shaking frame as she buried her face in his neck, her tears hot against his skin, her fingers clutching his shirt like it was the only solid thing in the world. And in that moment of pure terror, something shifted. Fear transmuted into need, need into recognition, recognition into a connection so visceral it felt like oxygen after drowning. Her heartbeat thundering against his ribs like a second storm inside his chest. They didn't kiss, not yet, but their foreheads pressed together, breaths mingling in the scant inches between them, sweat and tears and truth mixing on their skin. And Alex whispered, "I've got you, Liv. I've got you. I'm not letting go." And Olivia believed him in a way she hadn't believed anyone since childhood, since her mother promised, "It'll be better when he sleeps it off," and it never was, since her grandmother said, "You're stronger than you know," and then died before she could prove it. As hour 6 approached, the temperature hit 98 and dehydration set in, their voices hoarse, lips cracking, tongues sticking to the roofs of their mouths, throats raw from talking and crying and breathing the same recycled air. But they kept talking, because silence felt like surrender, because words were the only thing keeping the dark from swallowing them whole. About the scar on Alex's knuckle from punching a wall the night Elena left, the drywall dust still in his hair when he'd shown up to a 7 a.m. investor call with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. About the tattoo on Olivia's ribcage, "Still I Rise," and her mother's looping handwriting, inked the day she turned 21 with money saved from tips at the diner, the needle buzzing like a promise. About the way both had learned to smile with their mouths but not their eyes, to nod at the right times, to disappear in plain sight even when standing in the center of the room. When the lights finally surged and the doors slid open to reveal maintenance crews with headlamps that stabbed like accusations, flashing beacons cutting through the dark, and worried security shouting codes into radios and reaching for them with gloved hands, Alex stepped out first, legs trembling from disuse and adrenaline crash, turned back and said with raw wonder that cracked his voice in half, "Those weren't just 6 hours, Liv. They were the truest moments of my life. The first time I wasn't performing, the first time I was just me." But the spell shattered in the fluorescent hallway where Olivia, cheeks burning with shame and adrenaline and the sudden weight of eyes on her, couldn't meet his gaze because tomorrow she was still the invisible temp who'd seen the CEO cry, who'd held his hand while he admitted he sometimes stood on the balcony at 3 a.m. wondering if anyone would notice if he jumped, who'd heard him say her name like a prayer in the dark, and he was still the untouchable billionaire whose reputation terrified her, whose signature could end her career with a flick of a pen, whose life was a headline waiting to happen. Yet the next morning, as she placed her resignation letter on his desk with shaking fingers, effective immediately, "Thank you for the opportunity. I wish you and Blackwell Enterprises continued success in all future endeavors," the paper still warm from her grip, her handwriting neat, looping cursive that betrayed the tremor in her wrist, spilling across the page like a confession she couldn't voice aloud, like blood from a wound she'd tried to hide. Alex stared at it for a long moment, the words blurring as memories of the elevator flooded back in sensory waves, the way her pulse had fluttered against his thumb like a trapped bird learning it could fly, the salt of her tears soaking through a shirt collar and branding his skin, the moment she laughed at his stupid joke about corporate jargon being a second language, and the sound had cracked something open in his chest that had been sealed since childhood, since his father taught him that emotions were liabilities and tears were for the weak. He stood, rounding the desk until he was close enough to see the faint bruise of exhaustion under her eyes, the way her lower lip trembled before she caught it between her teeth,
the tiny freckle just above her collarbone that he'd memorized in the dark when she'd leaned into him and he'd counted it like a prayer. "Liv, you didn't overstep," he said, softly, and she flinched at the nickname no one else had ever used, the one that had slipped out in the dark when formality felt like a lie, when Mr. Grant would have been a betrayal. "We need to talk about last night, about everything, about what it meant, about what it could mean." She shook her head, curls falling across her face like a curtain she could hide behind. "There's nothing to talk about, Mr. Grant. I overstepped. I was unprofessional. I cried on you. I held your hand. I told you things I've never told anyone. I'm sorry." The formality slicing him deeper than any boardroom betrayal, deeper than Elena's note because it rebuilt the wall he thought they'd demolished brick by brick in the dark. He stood, rounding the desk until he was close enough to see the faint bruise of exhaustion under her eyes, the way her lower lip trembled before she caught it between her teeth, the tiny freckle just above her collarbone that he'd memorized in the dark when she leaned into him and he'd counted it like a prayer. "Liv, you didn't overstep," he said, softly, and she flinched at the nickname no one else had ever used, the one that had slipped out in the dark when formality felt like a lie, when Mr. Grant would have been a betrayal. "We need to talk about last night, about everything, about what it meant, about what it could mean." She shook her head, curls falling across her face like a curtain she could hide behind. "There's nothing to talk about, Mr. Grant. I overstepped. I was unprofessional. I cried on you. I held your hand. I told you things I've never told anyone. I'm sorry." The formality slicing him deeper than any boardroom betrayal, deeper than Elena's note because it rebuilt the wall he thought they'd demolished brick by brick in the dark. He stood, rounding the desk until he was close enough to see the faint bruise of exhaustion under her eyes, the way her lower lip trembled before she caught it between her teeth, the tiny freckle just above her collarbone that he'd memorized in the dark when she'd leaned into him and he'd counted it like a prayer. "Liv, you didn't overstep," he said, softly,
and she flinched at the nickname no one else had ever used, the one that had slipped out in the dark when formality felt like a lie, when Mr. Grant would have been a betrayal. "We need to talk about last night, about everything, about what it meant, about what it could mean." She shook her head, curls falling across her face like a curtain she could hide behind. "There's nothing to talk about, Mr. Grant. I overstepped. I was unprofessional. I cried on you. I held your hand. I told you things I've never told anyone. I'm sorry." The formality slicing him deeper than any boardroom betrayal, deeper than Elena's note, because it rebuilt the wall he'd thought they'd demolished brick by brick in the dark. He stood, rounding the desk until he was close enough to see the faint bruise of exhaustion under her eyes, the way her lower lip trembled before she caught it between her teeth, the tiny freckle just above her collarbone that he'd memorized in the dark when she'd leaned into him and he'd counted it like a prayer. "You didn't overstep," he said, voice low. "You saved me. Maybe for the first time since I was 12 and learned that feelings were liabilities, and men don't cry over dogs or wives or the fact that their empire is built on sand." Her laugh was bitter, broken, a sound that didn't belong in the pristine office with its leather chairs and city views and the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. "I was trapped in an elevator with you for 6 hours. That's not saving anyone. That's survival. That's two people trying not to lose their minds in a metal box." "It was for me," he countered, stepping closer until the heat of her body radiated against his, until he could see the pulse jumping in her throat like a trapped thing. "I've been sleepwalking through my life since Elena left, performing the role of Alexander Grant, CEO, perfect husband in absentia, perfect son, perfect everything. Last night I remembered what it felt like to be human, to be Alex, to laugh until my ribs hurt, to cry without shame, to hold someone's hand and mean it." Olivia's eyes flicked up, green and glassy with unshed tears that caught the morning light like shattered emeralds. "You don't know me, Alex, not really. You know the version who was scared and hot and had nothing left to lose in the dark, the version who told you about hiding in closets and drawing maps and selling her mother's ring. That's not who I am at work. Here I'm just the temp who brings your coffee, exactly 2 creams, no sugar."
And files your expense reports in triplicate, and disappears when the meeting starts, who smiles when you say good morning even though I want to scream? "You're wrong." His voice was fierce, protective, the same tone he'd used when the elevator lurched and she screamed and he'd caught her like she was the only real thing in the world. "I know you flinch when someone raises their voice because your father taught you volume equals violence.
I know you draw tiny flowers in the margins of legal pads when you're thinking, daisies and sunflowers that no one else notices, but I do. I know you hum when you're concentrating. Something classical. I think it's Debussy's Clair de Lune because I heard it once when you were proofreading the quarterly report. I know you take the stairs because elevators make you anxious, even before last night. And I know you were planning to quit because you thought I'd fire you for seeing me fall apart, for hearing me admit I sometimes stand on the balcony at 3 a.m. wondering if anyone would notice if I jumped, if the city would keep spinning without me. Her breath hitched, a sharp inhale that sounded like pain, like wonder. How? Because I've been watching you two live, not in a creepy way, he added quickly at her wide eyes, hands raised in surrender, in a noticing way. You're quiet, but you're not invisible, not to me, never to me. Even before the dark made everything else disappear. Even before I knew your laugh sounds like sunrise, or that you bite your lip when you're nervous, or that you always save the last bite of your sandwich for the birds on the rooftop. The silence stretched, thick with everything unsaid, the hum of the city 30 stories below, the distant ring of phones in the outer office, the tick of the clock that suddenly felt too loud, too final. Finally, Olivia whispered, I can't work for you anymore. Not after. She gestured vaguely between them, a motion that encompassed the elevator, the confessions, the hand-holding, the almost kiss when their foreheads touched and the world had narrowed to 2 heartbeats. Because of what happened in the elevator? His voice cracked on the last word, raw and vulnerable in a way that would have shocked his board. Because of what didn't happen, she corrected, voice breaking like ice under spring thaw. We were honest in there, raw, stripped down to the bones, and now we're back to this, suits and schedules, and me calling you Mr. Grant while you pretend last night never happened, while I pretend I don't know what your heartbeat sounds like when you're scared, pretend I don't know you snore softly when you're exhausted, pretend I didn't feel safe for the first time in years with your arms around me. The confession hung in the air like smoke, curling around them, and Alex took a step closer, close enough to see the pulse jumping in her throat, close enough to smell the faint lavender of her shampoo under the sweat and fear. Then don't pretend, stay, let's figure this out together. Let's be the people we were in the dark, but in the light too. Let's build something real from the truth we found. She shook her head, backing toward the door, her hand finding the knob like a lifeline, fingers white with pressure. I can't work for you anymore. Not after. She gestured vaguely between them, a motion that encompassed the elevator, the confessions, the hand-holding, the almost kiss when their foreheads touched and the world had narrowed to 2 heartbeats. Because of what happened in the elevator? His voice cracked on the last word, raw and vulnerable in a way that would have shocked his board. Because of what didn't happen, she corrected, voice breaking like ice under spring thaw. We were honest in there, raw, stripped down to the bones, and now we're back to this. Suits and schedules, and me calling you Mr. Grant while you pretend last night never happened, while I pretend I don't know what your heartbeat sounds like when you're scared, pretend I don't know you snore softly when you're exhausted, pretend I didn't feel safe for the first time in years with your arms around me. The confession hung in the air like smoke, curling around them, and Alex took a step closer, close enough to see the pulse jumping in her throat, close enough to smell the faint lavender of her shampoo under the sweat and fear. And don't pretend, stay. Let's figure this out together. Let's be the people we were in the dark, but in the light too. Let's build something real from the truth we found. She shook her head, backing toward the door, her hand finding the knob like a lifeline, fingers white with pressure. You're still married, Alex. On paper, in the eyes of the world, in the eyes of your board, and your shareholders, and the tabloids that follow you everywhere, in the eyes of Atlanta who might come back any day. The words were a bucket of ice water, dousing the fragile flame between them, and he flinched as if struck. Ilana and we've been over for years. She's in Paris now with someone else, some artist who paints her in ways I never could, who sees her in ways I stopped trying to. We just never made it official, Olivia finished, voice flat with understanding and pain. I know, you told me in the dark. You told me about the note and the separate bedrooms and the way you stopped touching because touch became obligation. But the world doesn't know, your board doesn't know, and I'm not going to be the reason Alexander Grant's perfect life cracks open in the tabloids, the reason you become a headline instead of a man, the reason people whisper about the temp who seduced the CEO in an elevator. She reached for the doorknob, fingers white. I'm sorry. The door clicked shut behind her with a finality that echoed louder than the elevator screech, leaving Alex staring at the resignation letter like it was written in a foreign language, the looping cursive suddenly incomprehensible, the words effective immediately, burning into his retinas like a brand.
She avoided him for 3 days, a masterclass in evasion that would have impressed a spy. Olivia took different elevators, the service ones that smelled of cleaning chemicals and desperation and the ghosts of 1,000 takeout lunches, different stairwells that left her calves burning by the 18th floor and her lungs gasping for air. Scheduled her breaks when she knew he'd be in meetings or on calls or flying to New York for a crisis acquisition. Ate lunch at her desk with headphones in, blasting classical music to drown out the memory of his voice, or in the basement cafeteria where executives never ventured and the fluorescent lights buzzed like dying insects. But the tower was only so big, a gleaming monolith of glass and steel with 42 floors and 3,000 employees and security cameras in every corner. And fate, or the universe's sense of humor, cruel and precise, kept throwing them together like magnets that refused to stay apart, like two planets caught in the same orbit. Monday morning in the copy room on the 17th floor, where Olivia dropped an entire ream of paper reaching for a file on the top shelf, the sheets exploding across the carpet like white confetti at a funeral, and Alex appeared like a ghost in the doorway to help pick it up. Kneeling in his charcoal Brioni suit that cost more than her monthly rent, their fingers brushing over the same sheet and both freezing as electricity crackled up their arms, a jolt that made her gasp and him curse under his breath, the paper trembling in their hands like it might ignite. Tuesday afternoon in the underground parking garage where her ancient Honda Civic, held together by hope and duct tape and the occasional prayer, refused to start with a pathetic whine, the battery dead from the cold snap that had rolled in overnight, and Alex materialized from the shadows with jumper cables in hand, kneeling in his $1,000 suit to connect batteries while she stood awkwardly beside him, inhaling the scent of his cologne mixed with motor oil and the faint metallic tang of the garage, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the scar on his forearm from a childhood bike accident he'd told her about in the dark when they'd traded stories like currency. Wednesday at noon on the rooftop garden, a hidden oasis of potted ferns and teak benches and a koi pond that most employees didn't know existed because it was tucked behind the mechanical room, where Olivia went to sketch during her lunch break, her pencil scratching out the skyline in quick, anxious strokes, the city sprawling beneath her like a circuit board of lights and lives, and found Alex already there, leaning against the railing staring out at the city like he was looking for something he'd lost in the concrete jungle below. His tie loosened, jacket abandoned over a chair, the top button of his shirt undone in a rare moment of disarray that made him look younger, more human. "I'm sorry," she said before he could speak, her voice carried away slightly by the wind that whipped between them. "For running, for leaving the letter, for everything, for not knowing how to be brave in the light." He turned, eyes bloodshot. He hadn't slept. The shadows under them deep enough to lose things in, the lines around his mouth etched deeper than she remembered. "Don't apologize for protecting yourself, Liv. I'm the one who complicated this, who dragged you into my mess without warning, who made you feel like you had to choose between your heart and your safety." They stood in silence, wind whipping between them, tugging at her curls and his usually perfect hair, the city sprawling beneath them like a promise and a threat. Finally, Alex said, "Elaine is coming back to Chicago, next week, to sign the papers, to make it official, to end the lie we've been living for 3 years. Olivia's heart stuttered, a painful lurch that felt like the elevator dropping again. "Divorce?" He nodded, throat working. "I should have done it years ago. I was scared, of failing, of admitting the marriage was a lie, of what my mother would say, what the board would think, what the tabloids would do. But after the elevator," he swallowed, "I can't keep living half a life, performing for an audience that doesn't care if I'm happy, if I'm real." She wanted to ask what that meant for them, for the fragile thing blooming between them like a flower in concrete, but the words stuck like burrs. Instead, she whispered, "I got a job offer in Seattle, a small publishing house. They want me to start in 2 weeks, editing manuscripts, maybe illustrating covers someday, a real salary, benefits, a chance to start over where no one knows my name or my past." The wind seemed to die, the city sounds fading to a hush, the koi pond still as glass. Alex's face went carefully blank, the mask sliding into place like armor. "Are you going to take it?" "I don't know." The honesty cost her, peeling back another layer. Part of me wants to run, to disappear like I always do when things get hard, when people get close. The other part, she trailed off, eyes on the horizon where the lake met the sky in a line of blue.
He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his irises, the tiny scar through his left eyebrow from a boarding school rugby match. The other part? Her voice was barely audible over the wind. Wants to see what happens if we stop running, if we stay and fight for whatever this is, if we build something from the truth instead of hiding from it. They didn't touch, didn't need to. The space between them hummed with possibility, with the weight of 6 hours in the dark and the promise of thousands more in the light, with the knowledge that some connections are forged in fire and can't be broken by distance or fear or paperwork. Elena arrived on a rainy Tuesday that turned the city into a watercolor painting, all blurred edges and running ink, all sharp cheekbones and designer trench coats in camel cashmere that cost more than Olivia's car, her blonde hair twisted into a chignon that spoke of old money and older expectations, looking every inch the society wife the tabloids loved to photograph at galas and charity auctions and the opening of envelopes. She and Alex met in his corner office with his floor-to-ceiling windows and the conference table that had seen more mergers than meals, their lawyers flanking them like silent sentinels in $1,000 suits, signing documents that dissolved a decade of careful pretense with the scratch of Mont Blanc pens on heavy cream paper that felt like skin. Olivia watched from her temporary desk outside, pretending to type quarterly reports while her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped thing. Every signature a small death, every page turn a step closer to freedom or loss. When Elena emerged, she paused at Olivia's desk, her perfume, something expensive in French, cutting through the stale office air. "You're the temp," she said, not unkindly, her voice smooth as silk but sharp as glass. Olivia stood, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. "Yes, ma'am." Elena studied her for a long moment, eyes the color of winter skies. "He talked about you, in the elevator when the power went out. He called me from the hospital after they checked him for dehydration. Said you reminded him what connection feels like, what it feels like to be seen." Olivia's cheeks burned, her throat closing. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Elena's smile was sad but genuine, a crack in the perfect facade. "I stopped trying to connect years ago. I stopped reaching, stopped asking, stopped caring. You didn't break us, Olivia. We were already broken. You just showed him the cracks, and maybe that's the kindest thing anyone's done for him in years." She extended a manicured hand, nails painted the color of fresh blood. "Take care of him. He's more fragile than he looks, more human than he lets anyone see." The handshake was brief, but it felt like absolution, like permission, like a door opening where a wall had been. Olivia watched Elena walk away, heels clicking on marble, and felt the world shift slightly on its axis. Alex found Olivia on the rooftop again that evening. Rain softened to mist that clung to their skin like secrets, the city lights blurred into halos below. "It's done," he said simply, voice rough from disuse or emotion. "Official tomorrow, filed with the courts, announced to the board, press release drafted." She nodded, throat tight. "And then? And then I'd like to take you to dinner, somewhere with terrible lighting and no board members, somewhere we can talk without the weight of elevators or ex-wives or resignation letters, somewhere I can tell you about the cabin in Montana, and you can show me your watercolors." She laughed, the sound watery and surprised. "You're asking me on a date?" "I'm begging," he corrected, stepping closer until the mist beaded on his lashes. 6 hours in the dark wasn't enough. I want 6,000 more, 60,000, a lifetime of mornings where I wake up to your humming and evenings where I fall asleep to your laugh. She stepped into his arms then, tentative, like testing thin ice, and he held her like she was made of spun glass and steel all at once, like she was the answer to every question he never asked. "I'm scared," she whispered against his chest, the fabric of his shirt damp with mist and tears. "Me too," he admitted, voice muffled in her hair. "But I'm more scared of losing this, losing you, losing the only real thing I've found in years." They stood there until the city lights blurred, two people who'd found truth in a broken elevator and were brave enough to build something new from the pieces, two hearts that had learned to beat in the dark and now dared to shine in the light. And though challenges still waited ahead, public scrutiny, complex conversations with Elena about assets and appearances, the balancing of two lives that had never been meant to intersect, the fear that love forged in crisis might not survive daylight, Alex felt peace for the first time in years, because he knew that no matter how chaotic the road ahead, he and Olivia had chosen each other, openly, bravely, and without fear, had chosen truth over performance, had chosen to rise from the dark together. And sometimes the greatest love stories weren't the ones born from perfection, but the ones forged in the middle of storms, where two souls stood together in a 6x6 box and decided that no matter how fierce the dark fell, they would choose each other again and again, in elevators and rooftops and rainy Tuesdays, in boardrooms and diners, and every ordinary moment in between, until the end of their days.